She steps back slightly from the massive cannon, feeling the cold metal beneath her fingertips and the reverberations of distant engines across the tarmac. Her heart pounds in a rhythm that matches the drone of aircraft overhead and the soft clank of tools in the hangar. She had been trained to focus on the task at hand, to keep her mind from wandering but the moment. The crew chief had stopped cold, her body froze, and the patch on her sleeve seemed to weigh more than the cannon itself. The patch was old, frayed at the edges, and its colors had dulled over time, but the symbol was unmistakable, and it burned in the memory of anyone who had ever heard the rumors. Her thoughts flickered to late-night conversations in the barracks, whispered warnings about the old mission, about the file that was buried, and the name no one dared speak. She tried to keep her hands steady as she wiped the oil from the barrel and aligned the firing mechanism in her mind, counting the pins and checking the calibration as she had done hundreds of times before, but every sound in the hangar now seemed amplified. Her breathing felt loud enough to alert everyone in a radius, and she could sense the crew chief lingering behind her, the silence stretching long and taut between them. He finally spoke in a low voice that carried the weight of authority and caution at the same time. He did not shout or accuse, he simply said words that made her chest tighten and her fingers hesitate mid-motion. He asked where she had gotten the patch, why she had it on her uniform now, and if she knew what it meant. She kept her eyes on the cannon, pretending to focus on the work as though the metal could shield her from the truth. She wanted to say it was a mistake, that she did not know, that she only found it in her locker that morning, but the story felt thin even to her own ears, and the silence that followed seemed to stretch longer than it should. Her mind raced over the possibilities of how it got there. Someone must have placed it there deliberately, or perhaps it had been left unnoticed for years. She could feel the crew chief watching her from the corner of her vision, and she knew he had the experience to read her hesitation. He had been at the base for decades and had seen young recruits come and go, some of them brash and bold, and others quiet and careful, but the patch symbol had always been a red flag, a cautionary mark that marked trouble and secrets she had only heard about in snippets. She wiped the barrel one more time, her glove smeared with oil that now felt like it covered her own conscience. She imagined the rumor that had always surrounded the patch, the tale of a mission that went wrong and the soldiers who vanished without explanation, the investigation that followed, and the secrecy that cloaked it all. Crew chief finally stepped closer, his boots echoing softly on the concrete floor, and the tension in the air made her muscles tighten. She could feel his eyes scanning every inch of her uniform, every fold and crease, as if trying to decode a hidden message. She imagined what it must look like to him, a young woman standing by the weapon that had taken countless lives and exercises and missions with a symbol on her sleeve that was not meant to be seen. The hangar suddenly felt smaller as the shadows of cranes and aircraft wings stretched across the walls, and the light flickered from the overhead lamps, creating shapes that seemed to move on their own. Her thoughts jumped from the possibility of reprimand to the unthinkable, the possibility that someone was testing the base, someone was watching, and the patch had been a signal all along. Her training told her to stay calm, to remain professional, to continue her maintenance routine, but every part of her body screamed alert, and she could feel her pulse in her temples. She tried to focus on the serial numbers etched into the metal, trying to remember that the cannon was just a machine, and the patch was just fabric. But the crew chief did not move away his silence, a pressure that weighed on her. She felt the history of the base, the stories of accidents, near misses, drills gone wrong, all mingling in the air around her, and she realized that she had been unknowingly stepping into a story much larger than herself. She took a slow, deliberate breath and imagined the patch as a puzzle piece, a fragment of a mystery that had remained unsolved for years. She looked up at the crew chief and saw his hands resting on his belt, his fingers curling around the edges of the leather strap, as if steadying himself. He asked her again if she knew anything about it, and she shook her head slowly, feeling the weight of her decision. She could Tell him the truth about where she found it, but she also felt the instinct to protect herself, to shield herself from the attention that this symbol would bring to someone who had no business knowing the story behind it. The hangar smelled of oil and metal and the faint hint of jet fuel, and she could imagine the echoes of soldiers past their shadows lingering in the corners. Like ghosts observing this exchange, the crew chief finally nodded his head slowly and asked her to step away from the cannon. He needed to inspect it and her uniform and everything she had touched. She obeyed silently, feeling her boots scrape against the concrete floor. Her gloves still in her hands, as if she could not let go of them. She watched as he approached the cannon with a measured pace, checking every panel, every joint and seam, and she realized that the symbol on her sleeve had changed the dynamic of this ordinary maintenance day into something charged with caution and vigilance. She wondered if anyone else in the base knew about it, or if the silence was universal and absolute. The hum of the air conditioning and the distant drone of engines outside became a background rhythm to the tension between them. She could feel every heartbeat in her chest, a drumbeat marking the passage of time. She remembered the stories she had heard in briefings and whispers. The near accidents, the unexplained alerts, the sudden evacuations, the notes left in files that no one opened, and she realized that this patch was more than fabric, more than a memory. It was a warning, a signal, a key to something hidden that she might have stumbled upon by accident. She swallowed hard and thought about how to act normal, to continue her duties without drawing more attention while knowing that every movement was being scrutinized. The crew chief finally spoke again, asking her to come with him to the office to explain everything in private. She nodded her head without speaking, feeling the metal beneath her fingers grow heavier as she released the cannon and followed him across the hangar floor. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, and for a moment she imagined every shadow watching, waiting for her mistake as they walked. The weight of the patch seemed to grow heavier with every step, the symbol a silent witness to something that neither of them could yet fully understand. She wondered if she had stepped into a trap, or she had unknowingly become part of a story that had been waiting for years to resurface. The crew chief did not speak, but his presence alone conveyed the seriousness of the moment. And she could sense the history of the base pressing down on them like the roof above. When they reached the office, she realized that the space was dimly lit, papers scattered across desks, the hum of electronics, a reminder of the constant vigilance required at the base. She wondered what files he would pull, what secrets he might reveal, what stories were hidden behind the doors of this room. The patch on her sleeve, it seemed to pulse with significance, as if it held a history waiting to be spoken aloud, and she felt a chill run down her spine, knowing that the maintenance day had shifted into something far more dangerous and consequential than she could have imagined. The office smelled faintly of coffee and metal, and the hum of the computers filled the space with a low, constant vibration. She stood stiffly near the door, her gloves still in her hands, as if holding them would anchor her to some semblance of control. The crew chief motioned for her to sit at the edge of the worn metal chair, his own hands resting on the edge of the desk as he leaned forward in a posture of quiet intensity. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them, thick and heavy, like the hangar air, before he finally asked her to explain everything from the moment she had discovered the patch to the moment he had seen it. She swallowed. Hardin began recounting the story, her voice low and steady. Though her pulse thundered in her ears, she explained how she had been cleaning the cannon, noticing nothing unusual until she had looked down at her sleeve and realized the patch was there. She spoke carefully, avoiding speculation, though her mind raced with questions about how it got there and why it was now in her possession. The crew chief listened with a tight expression, his eyes never leaving her face, as if trying to read beyond her words to some hidden truth he already suspected. When she finished, he leaned back and rubbed his eyes with one hand, the other still resting on the desk. His voice was deliberate when he spoke, explaining the history behind the symbol and The incident, it represented a mission years ago. That had gone wrong, the classified reports, the soldiers who had vanished, the protocols that had been rewritten, and the warnings never spoken aloud to anyone outside a select circle. He emphasized that the patch had always been a marker of danger, of something hidden and potentially deadly that could compromise operations if it resurfaced unexpectedly. Her stomach tightened at his words as she imagined the possibilities someone could be using the patch as a signal, a warning, or perhaps even a lure. She could feel the weight of the past pressing on her like a physical force, and the office seemed to shrink around her. She looked at the desk, at the scattered documents, the keys to aircraft logs and maintenance reports, and realized that anything could be connected in ways she could not yet see. The crew chief finally asked her if she had touched anything else on the aircraft, anything unusual, and she shook her head, realizing that the panel she had opened to find the patch might have been the only access point to something more significant. I nodded slowly and stood up, signaling that the situation required action. They needed to inspect the aircraft, immediately secure the surrounding area, and check the access points she had touched. Her pulse quickened as they left the office, moving back toward the hangar, each step echoing loudly in the corridor. She could feel her nerves taut like wires, ready to snap as the weight of the unknown pressed down on them. She wondered if anyone else in the base had noticed the patch, or if this had been meant for her eyes alone, a test, a trap, or a warning. When they reached the hangar, the sight of the massive A-10 cannon seemed different somehow, darker and more ominous. She could feel the shadows stretching across the floor, like fingers reaching for them. The crew chief signaled for the area to be cleared, and she watched as soldiers moved quickly, obeying the silent command. Their faces were focused and tense as they approached the aircraft, and she could sense the undercurrent of caution that ran through every motion like a current beneath calm waters. She stepped closer, watching him open the panels she had touched with precise care, checking the wires and mechanisms for tampering or unusual markings. Her fingers itched to touch the cannon again, to feel the metal as if reconnecting with the familiar could provide clarity, but she restrained herself, instead observing every detail. Her eyes caught faint scratches on the panel's, tiny irregularities that should not have been there. And she realized that this was more than a simple anomaly, more than a coincidence. The crew chief noticed them too and motioned her to stay back as he traced the lines of the markings with gloved fingers. Her mind raced, imagining who could have done this, why, and what their next move might be. Suddenly the hum of distant engines shifted a note higher, an alert in the background that made her glance toward the open hangar doors. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise as she saw shadows moving too quickly for routine activity. Someone was near the perimeter of the base, and the pattern of their approach felt deliberate, calculated, like a predator circling its prey. She glanced at the crew chief, whose eyes had narrowed and lips pressed into a thin line, signaling that the silent alarm was understood. An immediate action was required. He turned back to the aircraft, signaling for her to help document every anomaly. She grabbed a notepad and began sketching the scratches, the unusual placement of the patch, the subtle misalignment of panels, noting every detail that might seem insignificant to others, but felt vital now. Her hands trembled slightly, though she forced herself to write clearly, each line a tether to sanity, as the tension in the hangar thickened around them. The crew chief worked alongside her, checking bolts and wires, each movement precise, methodical, yet carried a sense of urgency that she had never seen before. As minutes passed, the realization settled on her that this might not be an isolated incident. Someone had tampered with the aircraft intentionally, and the patch had been a signal, a breadcrumb meant to draw attention and perhaps lead to discovery of something hidden. She looked at the massive gun, thinking about the firepower it represented, the lives it could end, and the responsibility that rested on those around it. She realized that if the hidden threat was not contained, the consequences could be catastrophic. The crew chief finally straightened and motioned for her to step aside. He picked up a radio and spoke in low tones, issuing orders. She watched him communicate clearly, but felt the weight of secrecy pressed down on her shoulders. She could sense the base shifting into alert mode, a quiet tension moving like ripples across still water. Everyone she passed seemed more aware, more cautious, each movement controlled, each glance measured. She tried to steady her breathing, imagining herself a part of the careful machinery of the base, yet acutely aware that the patch had disrupted that order. Investigation extended through the day, examining every system related to the cannon, checking for any signs of sabotage or foreign interference. She assisted where she could, noting discrepancies, anomalies, and odd marks, documenting everything meticulously. As the crew chief coordinated efforts across the hangar, her mind refused to quiet each note. She wrote seemed to amplify the seriousness of the moment. She wondered if the patch had been left as a warning, or if it had been intended to trap someone. Into discovery, a test of vigilance or courage. By late afternoon, they discovered the final clue. A small panel behind the cannon shifted just slightly out of alignment, revealing faint tool marks as if someone had opened it recently. She felt her stomach twist, knowing that the discovery validated all the warnings she had been given in whispers. Years before, the crew chief inspected it with a careful eye and nodded, signaling that the threat had been real and immediate, and that the patch had been the key to uncovering it. She realized that her ordinary slumped-state day of maintenance had transformed into a confrontation with history and hidden dangers. The base secured the area and initiated further investigations. She stood back and watched the crew chief give precise instructions, coordinating soldiers and technicians. She felt a sense of awe mixed with unease, knowing that she had stumbled upon something long buried yet incredibly dangerous. She looked at the patch on her sleeve, imagining its journey from a symbol of warning to a trigger for discovery, and she felt a mixture of fear and resolve, knowing that she would never forget the day a simple act of cleaning had placed her in the center of something much larger than herself. By evening, the tension in the hangar had eased slightly, though the weight of discovery remained heavy. She realized that the crew chief had respected her composure and diligence, that she had faced the Shisu's situation without panic and had helped uncover a hidden threat. She wondered about the next steps, about the hidden histories and the quiet signals that might exist elsewhere on the base, waiting to be noticed. She carefully removed the patch, placing it in a secure envelope, knowing that the story it represented was far from over.